1945, after more than 20 years in power, Mussolini was running for his life as his country collapsed around him. But his escape failed, and within days, he and Clara Petacci were captured, executed, and taken to the streets of Milan, where years of anger exploded in a way the world would never forget. It was one of the most shocking and brutal public endings in modern history. It started in July 1943, when Mussolini was removed from power, arrested, and replaced. But German forces rescued him and set him up as the leader of a weak puppet state in northern Italy called the Italian Social Republic. On paper, Mussolini was still in charge. In reality, he was just a figure controlled by the Nazis. By April 1945, that fake government was crumbling fast. Allied forces were pushing from the south. Resistance fighters, known as Italian partisans, were rising across the north. Cities were being taken back, one by one. Milan, the economic heart of Italy, was slipping out of fascist control. Mussolini knew what was coming. He had seen what happened to dictators who lost. Prison would be the best-case scenario. Execution was more likely. And right beside him, through all of this, was Clara Petacci. She wasn't just someone in the background. She refused to leave him, even when escape became dangerous. She came from a wealthy family and could have stayed safe, but she chose to follow him to the very end. Around April 25, 1945, Mussolini made the decision to leave Milan. And this wasn't just a simple move to another safe location. It was a desperate attempt to disappear before everything closed in on him. By this point, Milan was no longer under real fascist control. Workers were striking, resistance fighters were taking over key buildings, and ordinary people were openly celebrating in the streets because they knew the regime was collapsing. Mussolini had lost support not just politically, but socially too. And that's when things get dangerous for any leader, because there's nowhere left to hide in plain sight. At first, Mussolini actually tried to negotiate instead of running. He had a meeting with representatives of the Italian resistance, hoping to reach some kind of deal that would let him escape, or at least avoid execution. But the talks went nowhere. The resistance had no interest in saving him. They had seen too much over the past 2 decades, including war, arrests, executions, and destruction. And by 1945, they weren't in a forgiving mood. So he linked up with retreating German forces. These weren't strong or organized units anymore. These were tired, beaten troops, pulling back toward the north as Allied forces advanced deeper into Italy. The convoy he joined was part of a German anti-aircraft unit, moving toward the Swiss border. Switzerland was neutral, and if he could cross into it, he might have been interned instead of killed. From there were still possible routes out. Spain, under Francisco Franco, was friendly to fascist leaders, and South America had already become a destination for escaping Nazis and collaborators. To make this plan work, Mussolini had to completely change his identity. He put on a German military coat and helmet, and tried to stay quiet, sitting in the back of a truck among soldiers. The same man who had once stood on balconies giving speeches to thousands of cheering Italians was now trying not to be noticed at all. At the same time, Clara Petacci made her own decision that would seal her fate. Even some people close to Mussolini suggested that she go, but she refused. She followed the convoy, sometimes traveling in a separate vehicle, but always staying close enough to remain with him. The convoy itself moved slowly along the western side of Lake Como, which is usually known as a peaceful and beautiful area, surrounded by mountains and small towns. But in April 1945, it had turned into a tense and dangerous route. German forces were retreating in large numbers, and Italian partisans were taking control of roads and setting up checkpoints to stop exactly this kind of escape. Every few kilometers, there was a risk of being stopped, searched, or attacked. By April 27th, the convoy reached the small lakeside town of Dongo. This is where the plan started to fall apart completely. Partisans from the 57 Garibaldi Brigade had already set up a roadblock. The convoy had no easy way around, and turning back wasn't really an option either. The partisans blocked the road and began checking every single vehicle, one by one, soldier by soldier. They ordered everyone out of the vehicles and began inspecting documents, faces, uniforms, and behavior. At first, Mussolini managed to avoid attention. He stayed silent, kept his head down, and relied on the German soldiers around him to blend in. For a short moment, it actually seemed like his plan might work. But small details started to give him away. Some accounts suggest that his physical appearance raised suspicion, while others point to his behavior. He wasn't acting like a typical soldier. And in situations like this, even small differences can stand out. Eventually, a partisan either recognized him or became suspicious enough to check more closely. When they looked under his helmet and really examined his face, the disguise fell apart instantly. This wasn't just another soldier. This was Mussolini himself. The moment he was identified, everything changed. He was pulled out of the group and separated from the German troops. There was no confusion about what this meant. His attempt to escape had failed completely. The reaction from the partisans was immediate and emotional. This wasn't just a prisoner. This was the man who had ruled Italy for over 20 years, who had aligned the country with Nazi Germany. Many of the partisans had either fought against his forces directly or had lost friends and family because of his regime. Seeing him standing there, unarmed and powerless, created a mix of anger and disbelief. Shortly after, Clara Petacci was also found and detained. She had stayed close enough to the convoy that she was quickly linked to Mussolini. Even at that point, when everything was clearly over, she didn't try to distance herself from him. She remained by his side, fully aware of what could happen next. Mussolini and Petacci were taken into custody and moved away from the main road to avoid any rescue attempts or chaos. They were transported to the nearby village of Mezzegra, a quiet place that suddenly became the center of one of the most important moments in Italian history. Now the situation became even more serious. There was no clear system in place for what to do next. The war was still ongoing, communication was difficult, and decisions had to be made quickly. There was no time to organize a formal trial. There was no secure place to hold him long term. And there was a real fear that if they delayed, something could change. One of the biggest fears was a German rescue attempt. Even though Nazi Germany was collapsing, there were still armed units in the region, and Mussolini was seen as a valuable figure. If word spread too widely and too quickly, there was a chance, even if small, that German forces could try to free him. Another concern was what would happen if Allied forces reached the area first. Leaders from countries like the United States and Britain might have insisted on taking Mussolini into custody and putting him on trial, similar to what happened during the Nuremberg trials. That process could have taken months or years, and for many Italian partisans, that didn't feel like justice. They wanted a direct and immediate end. The decision-making process involved local partisan leaders and higher political influence, especially from groups connected to the Italian Communist Party. Orders were passed down through the resistance network that Mussolini should be executed without delay. This wasn't a spontaneous act by a random group. It was a decision shaped by the political and military situation at the time. The responsibility for carrying out the execution was given to Walter Aldicio, a partisan leader who used the name Colonel Valerio during the war. He was sent specifically to handle the situation and made sure it was completed. That night, Mussolini and Clara Petacci were held under guard. There was no formal announcement, no public gathering, and no dramatic last-minute negotiations. The atmosphere was quiet, but tense. Everyone involved understood that the next day would bring a final outcome. Clara Petacci still had opportunities to separate herself, at least in theory. Some accounts suggest that she was not the main target and could have stepped away, But she didn't take that option. She stayed with Mussolini, fully aware that whatever happened to him would likely happen to her as well. By the morning of April 28, 1945, everything was set. Audicio arrived and took control of the situation. There was no delay or hesitation at this point. Mussolini and Petacci were taken from the house where they had been kept and placed into a vehicle. They were driven only a short distance, which shows how quickly and locally the decision was being carried out. There was no plan to move them far away or hide what was about to happen. Both of them were brought to a spot near Villa Belmonte in Mezzegra. The location wasn't a major public square or a planned stage. It was a simple roadside area, quiet and controlled, chosen because it allowed the execution to happen quickly without interference. There were only a few people present, mostly armed partisans. This wasn't meant to be a public event at that moment. The goal was to carry out the execution quickly and then move the bodies elsewhere. Walter Audicio stepped forward to carry out his orders. Mussolini stood there facing the reality of what was about to happen. After years of holding power, giving speeches, and controlling a country, his final moments were happening in silence, without ceremony, without any of the authority he once had. Clara Petacci stayed right next to him. According to several accounts, when the execution was about to happen, she moved closer and tried to position herself in front of Mussolini, almost as if she wanted to shield him. Whether this was instinct, loyalty, or panic, it showed that she had fully accepted her fate alongside him. Audicio attempted to fire his weapon, but there are reports that it initially jammed or didn't fire properly, which caused a brief delay. He then used another firearm to carry out the execution. Multiple shots were fired at close range. Mussolini was hit and collapsed quickly. Clara Petacci was also struck and fell beside him. The entire event lasted only seconds once the shooting began. There was no prolonged struggle, no final speech. Just a sudden and violent end. After the execution, the bodies were left on the ground briefly while the situation was secured. Then they were lifted and placed into a vehicle, along with the bodies of other executed fascist officials, including figures like Alessandro Pavolini and Achille Starace. There was no delay because the partisans already knew what they wanted to do next. This wasn't just about confirming that Mussolini was dead. They wanted the public to see it with their own eyes, especially in the city where his power had once been strongest. The bodies were driven south toward Milan, a journey that took several hours through roads still full of tension and scattered fighting. Even though the war was nearly over, northern Italy was still unstable, and moving such high-profile bodies carried risks. But the partisans pushed forward anyway, because they understood the symbolic power of what they were about to do. Milan was not chosen randomly. This was the city where Mussolini had built much of his political base in the early 1920s. It was where fascist rallies had taken place, where speeches were given, and where the regime had once looked strong and untouchable. Bringing his body back there wasn't just practical, it was a message. It showed that everything he built had collapsed right at its center. The truck arrived at Piazzale Loreto, a place that already carried heavy meaning. Less than a year earlier, on August 10, 1944, fascist forces had executed 15 Italian partisans in that exact square. Their bodies had been left lying on the ground for hours as a warning to anyone thinking of resisting. People in Milan had been forced to walk past them, to see what happened to those who opposed the regime. That memory was still fresh in everyone's mind. Now the situation had completely reversed. Instead of resistance fighters lying dead in the square, it was the leader of the fascist regime himself. The same place that had once been used to spread fear was now being used to show the fall of that power. The bodies were unloaded and placed on the ground. Mussolini, Petacci, and the others were laid out in the open, without ceremony or protection. At first, only a small number of people noticed what was happening. Early morning workers and passerbys stopped and looked. unsure of what they were seeing. But word spread fast, and within a short time, more and more people started arriving. These people came with emotion built up over years. The city had suffered under bombings, food shortages, strict control, and constant fear during fascist rule and the war. Many families had lost sons, fathers, and brothers. Others had lived through arrests, torture, or public punishment. So when people heard that Mussolini was finally dead and right there in the open, they rushed to see it for themselves. The crowd grew quickly. It wasn't just resistance fighters. It was ordinary people, including factory workers, women who had struggled through the war, elderly citizens who had lived through the entire fascist period, and even children brought along by their families. At first, people stood and stared. Some were silent, trying to process what they were seeing. But that didn't last long. The mood shifted as emotions took over. Anger started to show. And once it began, it spread fast through the crowd. People started shouting insults and curses. Then it became physical. Some moved forward and kicked the bodies. Others spat on them. Shoes, stones, and different objects were thrown. In some cases, people struck the corpses directly. This wasn't organized or controlled in any way. There were no leaders directing the crowd. It was raw emotion, coming out all at once after years of being held back. Mussolini's body became the main target because he represented everything people blamed for their suffering. But Clara Petacci was not spared either. Even though she had no official political role, she was seen as someone who had stood by him willingly. To the crowd, that was enough. She became part of what they hated, and her body was treated the same way. The situation kept getting more intense. The crowd became so large and aggressive that it was hard for the partisans to maintain any control. At one point, the bodies were at risk of being completely disfigured or even torn apart because of the violence. This is when the partisans realized they needed to do something quickly, not to stop the display, but to manage it in a way that kept order. So they made another decision. They moved the bodies a short distance within the same area to make the display more controlled and visible. They chose a metal girder at a nearby petrol station, a simple structure that could support weight and lift the bodies above the crowd. The bodies of Mussolini, Clara Petacci, and other executed fascists were then hung upside down by their feet. Ropes were tied around their ankles, and they were lifted so that their heads pointed toward the ground, suspended in the air. This moment is important because it turned the scene from a public viewing into a powerful symbol. Hanging them upside down was not random. It was meant to show complete defeat and humiliation. In Italian culture at the time, this kind of display was sometimes associated with traitors or those seen as having brought shame. For Mussolini, who had once controlled the country, this was the exact opposite of the image he had built during his rule. Photographers and journalists began capturing images of the scene. Some of the most famous photographs from World War II come from this exact moment. There is also real footage filmed of people present, which is why this event is often described as one of the most documented public executions of that time. These images would later spread across the world, becoming a lasting record of how Mussolini's rule ended. After several hours of public display, the bodies were taken down from the metal girder and placed back onto vehicles. From there, they were transported for official handling and identification. Doctors later carried out examinations to confirm Mussolini's identity and document the cause of death, which was important for the historical record, and to avoid any rumors that he had escaped. Mussolini's body was eventually buried in an unmarked grave in Milan to prevent it from becoming a place of support or gathering for remaining fascists. However, this wasn't the end of his story, even after burial. In 1946, his body was actually stolen by fascist sympathizers and hidden for months before being recovered by authorities. Years later, in 1957, his remains were finally returned to his hometown of Predappio, where he was given a more permanent burial. Clara Petacci's body was handled separately. She was buried without the same level of attention or controversy. But her death remained closely tied to Mussolini's story because of her decision to stay with him until the end. Italy at this point was entering a new phase. The war in Europe was almost over, and the country was trying to rebuild after years of destruction. Just 2 days after Mussolini's execution on April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler died in Berlin, marking another major collapse in the Axis leadership. Within days, Germany would surrender, and the war in Europe would come to an end. Mussolini's execution sent a clear message, not just within Italy, but across the world. It showed that fascist rule had ended completely, and that even the most powerful leaders could fall in a matter of days once their support disappeared.